It is Tuesday, April 7th, and we are in Chapter 6 of Echo. For the rest of the week, Mike fretted about their escape. 4 lowers had been fostered out within the last few days. Pennyweather was getting rid of the little lads like they were a grocer's special, 2 for the price of 1. How much time did Mike have? How far could they travel before Pennyweather became suspicious and reported them? What would happen if a truant officer caught up to them? The questions continued to weigh on Mike as he mopped the stairs on Friday afternoon. Mrs. Godfrey appeared below him in the entry. "Michael, Miss Pennyweather wants you right quick in the dining hall. Your brother is already there." Mike dropped the mop and clambered down the stairs. Out of breath, he arrived in the dining hall to find a man in overalls, packing up tools, and Pennyweather wiping down the piano with lemon oil. 3 chairs had been positioned nearby in a straight line. Frankie sat on the piano bench, swinging his legs. Pennyweather looked up. "Michael, please join your brother." He did, and Frankie leaned over and whispered, "Pennyweather had the piano tuned. She wants us to play a song." Mike sighed and tried to calm his racing heart. "Is that all?" Frankie nodded. "That's what she said." Frankie wasn't being fostered out. Mike couldn't decide if he was disappointed or relieved. The man closed his toolbox. "All done, Mrs. Pennyweather. I fixed the pedals, too. She's got a beautiful sound, and you don't need to pay me anything for them orphan boys." Pennyweather smiled. "I am so grateful for your kindness." When he was gone, she put her hands on her hips and faced Mike and Frankie. "I have some men coming to look at the piano. They've asked if we have anyone here who is musical so they can determine the quality." She shook her head. "Don't know why they can't do that themselves. Regardless, you are the only ones who can play this noisemaker without pounding on it. The cooks told me you've been practicing some piece every night after dinner that makes them cry. Sentimental fools. So play that one and make it sound just as good, or you'll both be back in the cellar." She turned and began polishing the lid. Frankie tugged on Mike's sleeve and whispered, "But Granny picked here 'cause of the piano." Mike leaned his head toward Frankie's. "Shh! Better we keep Pennyweather happy." 2 men wearing suits with vests walked into the room. The taller, gray-haired man carried a briefcase. "Mrs. Pennyweather, I presume? I'm Mr. Golding, attorney at law, and this is my associate, Mr. Howard." The younger man was the same height as Mike, fair-headed and freckled. "I'm also a family friend of the client. I've been given the authority to make a decision in this matter." They both removed their hats. "Gentlemen," said Pennyweather, nodding, "pardon me, but I'm confused. Why do we need lawyers for this matter?" Mr. Golding frowned. "Certainly, if we come to an agreement, Miss Pennyweather, anything needs to be legal." Pennyweather shrugged and looked puzzled. "Well, then, let's get on with it. Here are Michael and Franklin Flannery, our best musicians, like you asked." "Wonderful," said Mr. Golding. "We'd like to hear them play." "Of course," said Pennyweather, sweeping a hand toward the chairs. "Please sit down, gentlemen. Boys." Mike and Frankie slid around and faced the keyboard. "America the Beautiful," whispered Mike. "You come in after Amber Waves of Grain, just like I taught you. But at first, nice and slow like a lullaby until almost the end." "I know," said Frankie. "Then like a storm until the sea to shining sea part, and we make it all calm again." He poised his hands ready. Mike began to play. After a few bars, he nodded to Frankie, who came in on cue. Mike couldn't believe this was the same piano. There were no sour notes, no avoiding a sharp because it wasn't. The man was right. The piano had a beautiful tone. Mike filled up on the sound, as if he were eating something delicious, each bite better than the last. For a few moments there was nothing but the music. No worries, no Pennyweather, just him and Frankie. Mike could almost believe that he was back in Granny's parlor, playing on a Sunday afternoon with the window open so everyone in the neighborhood could hear the music and have a little beauty in their lives. Mike used the damper pedal and the chords filled the room. Before the last bars, he stopped playing altogether and let Frankie finish the song alone, simple and sweet. Mike glanced around the room. At the far end of the hall, the cooks had stepped from the kitchen and were dabbing at their eyes. Uppers congregated at the windows and leaned on the sills. Lowers crowded the doorways, peeking in. Pennyweather furrowed her brow as if she didn't believe what she was hearing. Mr. Golding raised an eyebrow at Mr. Howard. After Frankie played the last note, there was a long breath of silence. Then the lads began to clap and whistle until Pennyweather stood, spun around, and waved everyone out. Mike and Frankie shifted around on the bench. Mr. Howard leaned forward. "Michael, how old are you?" 11, sir." "How did you learn to play the piano?" His voice was soft and kind. He nodded to Frankie. "Our grandmother, she was a piano teacher." "Mike's the best player I know," said Frankie. Mr. Howard smiled. "And how old are you, Franklin?" "Everyone calls me Frankie. I'm 7, sir, almost 8. I'm the second best player I know, but Mike's a progeny." Mr. Howard smiled at his misuse of the word prodigy. "You're right, Frankie. He's very good. And so are you." He looked at Mike. "You arranged that piece?" "Yes, sir." "That was quite beautiful." He cleared his throat. "How long have you two been here?" 5 months and a few weeks, said Mike. "We lived with Granny most of our lives until we came here." "Granny picked here 'cause it was the only orphanage with a piano," said Frankie. "We gotta have a piano." Pennyweather clapped her hands to interrupt. "Gentlemen, can we get back to business? Boys, you are dismissed." "Actually, I'd like them to stay," said Mr. Howard. Pennyweather pursed her lips. "I don't see any reason." Mr. Golding interrupted. "Miss Pennyweather, our firm represents Eunice Dow Sturbridge. She is the daughter of Thomas Dow. Are you familiar with the name?" "Who in Pennsylvania isn't?" said Pennyweather. "Mr. Dow was a businessman. Tire company, wasn't it? I read in the newspaper he died last year." Pennyweather crossed her arms. "What does he have to do with any of this?" "Now that Mr. Dow has passed, his daughter is without any family," said Mr. Howard. She'd like to adopt a child." Mrs. Pennyweather's eyes darted from one man to the other. "I thought you were here to buy the piano." "Oh, heavens no," said Mr. Golding. "And I apologize if our intention was misleading. We asked if you had a piano and if there was a child here who was musical who could play it for us, so we could determine the quality of the musician. You see, it is the child who is musical. It must be a child who is musical." Mr. Howard nodded. "Mrs. Sturbridge is a pianist of great talent, so you understand the desire for a child with the same inclination. We'd like to start adoption proceedings today." Okay, I'm going to continue. The next chapter is kind of short, so we're going to continue to the next one. Mike's thoughts played leapfrog. They wanted to adopt a boy today? Miss Sturbridge was a rich woman. If she adopted Frankie, he'd have a home. He'd be safe. He'd have things. He'd probably go to a private school, and Mike would know where he was. This was Frankie's chance. "The papers have been readied in accordance," said Mr. Golding, reaching for his briefcase and opening it on his lap, "and I can file them at the courthouse this afternoon. We're prepared to make a donation to the orphanage and give you a stipend for your personal attention to this matter." A smile played on Pennyweather's lips. "I will gratefully accept for the orphans." She gestured toward Mike and Frankie. "Now, as to who to adopt, my recommendation is that you take Franklin, and don't worry about Michael. He'll be grateful for his brother's unusually good fortune." She shot Mike a smile, but he knew it was meant as a warning. "I don't want to leave Mike," said Frankie. Mike wrapped an arm around him. "I'd like to talk to the boys in private," said Mr. Howard. Pennyweather stood. "I'm afraid that's not allowed." Mr. Howard stood too, and Mr. Golding snapped his briefcase shut. Then I suppose we'll be going to pay a visit at Hathaway House." "Oh, wait. Don't be hasty, gentlemen. I can make an exception." She stepped into her office and closed the door. As soon as she was gone, Frankie blurted, "They're not supposed to separate us." Mike looked from Mr. Golding to Mr. Howard. "Sirs, if you mean to take only one of us, it should be Frankie. He's one of the youngest here. Mrs. Pennyweather plans to put me out to hire soon. I'm not old enough, but I guess I'm big enough. It's why she's not too keen on me leaving. But if I'm out working for months at a time, I won't be able to look out for Frankie, and he's still little." No, Mike, whimpered Frankie, his eyes tearing up. We stick together, remember? And we're going to save our money for harmonicas and try out for Hoxie's band, and he'll find us a home and... Frankie cried harder. Mike dropped down on one knee and pulled him close. Don't throw a fit this time, don't you see? If you go today, I'll know where to find you, and you won't end up in the state home. He swallowed hard, looking at Mr. Golding, and blinked back his own tears. Could I write and come visit him? Of course, said Mr. Golding. I could even put a stipulation in the paperwork. That means make sure that he could. Frankie shook his head, sniffling. No, and I bet there's a piano. Mike looked at Mr. Howard. He nodded. There's a piano that sorely needs playing. Mike stroked Frankie's back. He knew this was the right thing, but he couldn't stand looking in the kid's eyes and seeing the hurt. I knew it. There's a piano, and I'll visit regular. It will all be okay, I promise. Mike looked at Mr. Howard for reassurance. He turned away from Mike's gaze and walked back to the window. A moment later he came back, blinking, his eyes bright. He cleared his throat and said to Mr. Golding, It doesn't seem like a promising place, does it? No, said Mr. Golding, and it has a dreadful standing. But hard as it is, Mr. Howard, time is of the essence. This is the 5th orphanage we've visited in the last 2 weeks, and there's not been one child who came close to either of these boys. They're polite, endearing, and from what I've heard, extremely talented. If one of them will do, then let's take care of business. Mr. Howard paced back and forth with his hands on his hips. The office door opened. Pennyweather came back into the room. Gentlemen, we understand that Michael is to be put out for hire soon, said Mr. Howard. That's right, said Pennyweather. Making a child an indentured servant is against the law. It's called fostering now, Mr. Howard. If a business owner or farmer comes here to foster a child, it's none of my business what the child is expected to do to earn his keep. Call it what you like, indenturing, fostering, adopting, it's all the same to me. Frankie looked up at Mike, tears streaming down his cheeks. I don't want to leave you. Mike forced a smile. You'll be in a nice house, and when I visit, we'll play that piano together. I bet there's trees to climb too, and a big yard and good food. I bet they have Wheaties and Cocoa Malt. You'll go to school. I don't care about Wheaties and Cocoa Malt. I want to stay with you. Frankie sobbed into Mike's arm. Mike's resolve crumbled. He knelt in front of Frankie and held him tight. Mr. Howard ran both hands through his hair. He walked to Mr. Golding and whispered in his ear. You're the representative in this matter, said Mr. Golding. You've made up your mind? I have, said Mr. Howard. Very well, said Mr. Golding. He turned to Pennyweather. I'd like to speak with you in your office and draw up the papers. I think you'll be very happy with Franklin, said Pennyweather, smiling. And let's discuss that donation for the unfortunate orphans and my small stipend. Mr. Golding smiled back. Oh, Mrs. Pennyweather, I think you underestimate us. We don't do anything in a small way. Okay, now let's look at your questions that I sent you last week. The one we didn't answer yesterday says, how does the harmonica band give Frankie hope? So that's what I want you to look at today. How did that give Frankie hope? The next one says, how did Pennyweather's misunderstanding lead Mike and Frankie to Mr. Howard and Mr. Golding? Okay, so she misunderstood. She thought that they were looking at the piano. Do you think she would have chosen them if she knew their true intentions? Why or why not? Okay, that's interesting. Do we think she would have chosen the boys if she knew they were going to be adopted? Why does Mike change his mind and try to convince Frankie that it would be okay if they were separated? Okay, why do you think he changes his mind? Because he kneels down and he tries to get Frankie to go. Why does he do that? He's trying to be brave, isn't he? Okay, and he knows what's coming, so he's trying to do the best for Frankie. Put that in your own words. Okay, now we will tackle the other ones in the next chapter. In the comments below this, I want you to describe the two men that came to the orphanage and tell me what they wanted. Okay, Tell me about the two men that came and tell me what they wanted. All right. We'll